We're joined tonight by Margaret Sullivan. After a brief introduction, we'll turn the time over to Margaret. She'll talk about her new book, which I think you all know about, but Newsroom Confidential. We'll have time for some questions and answers questions at least from the audience.
Take a stab at anything you said.
After that, we'll also have time for a signing just back in the other room. So after we hear from Margaret and have our questions, we'll all just head back into the other room. You can purchase the book if you haven't already from or register in the other room. Then have a chance to interact with Margaret. So Margaret Sullivan's career includes groundbreaking positions in multiple high-profile newsrooms. She worked at the Buffalo News, where she rose to chief editor, the New York Times as public editor, and the Washington Post as media columnist. She's a graduate of Georgetown University and Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Sullivan was a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board from 2011 to 2012 and was twice elected as a director of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. The new book, Newsroom Confidential. In the new book, she chronicles her years in the trenches, battling sexism and throwing elbows in a highly competitive newsroom. In 2012, Sullivan was appointed the public editor of the New York Times, the first woman to hold that important role. Sullivan recounts how she navigated the paper's controversies, from Hillary Clinton's emails to the need for greater diversity in the newsroom, and a few others. Sounds like
Lots of others.
In 2016, Sullivan left for the Washington Post, where she had a front row seat to the rise of Donald Trump and America, media, and politics. Sullivan takes us behind the scenes of the nation's most influential news outlets to explore how Americans lost trust in the news and what it will take to regain it. Now, Margaret Sullivan.
Thank you so much.
It's not, unfortunately. We've tried to. In fact, I'll go play with it some more.
Is it because of the noise?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm pretty loud.
Okay.
I'll see what I can do. We haven't been successful.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out. This is really fun for me to talk to people about my book. So when I was writing Newsroom Confidential, I started off writing a pretty much a straight memoir, starting with, how I got into journalism and all of that sort of thing, and going through my career. But it took sort of a turn and became something not quite a memoir, but something else. And it's sort of something with some passion and some recommendations and some complaints about the national media and some thoughs about how we can fix it. And at one point, I saw a tweet from my colleague, Carlos Lozada, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning book critic, then at the Washington Post. He's now at the New York Times. But he said, if I see, so he's a book critic, so he sees books coming across his desk all the time. And he said, if I see one more book described as part memoir, part manifesto, I'm going to scream. And I thought, hang on, because there's one more coming your way. So it, I did find that my time at the Washington Post, where I saw the country take a very strange turn, and the way the media covered Trump and has covered the aftermath, and as we go into the midterms and as we go into the 2024 election cycle, I'm worried. So, but I would like to talk with you about both parts of my book, both aspects of it, both the memoir part and the manifesto part. And I thought I would do a little bit of reading. I remember reading this, I don't know if you guys read any science fiction, but there's an old science fiction book called Stranger in a Strange Land, Robert Heinlein. And there's a line in it, a poet who reads his verse in public may have other nasty habits. So, that gives, not to suggest I'm a poet, but I don't want to overdo the reading out loud part of things, but I thought I might give you a little bit of a flavor for it. So I spent most of my career at the Buffalo News. I grew up in Lackawanna, New York, which is just outside Buffalo. The paper was owned by Warren Buffett the whole time I was there. And I started out as a summer intern and, fresh out of school, and I was very excited to be there. And I worked my way up over years and eventually became the editor of the paper. And I did that job for 12 years. And it was challenging to get the job, and it was challenging to do the job. So I thought I would read a little bit from a part of it that has to do with Hillary Clinton before all the stuff happened with her running for president and her emails and all of that. So in 1998, I write, Daniel Patrick Moynihan announced that he would be retiring from the Senate after 24 years. And he tapped Hillary Clinton, still the first lady at that point, as his preferred successor. Not everybody agreed that this was a good idea. Plenty of New Yorkers, along with Clinton's many political enemies in Washington, depicted her as an opportunistic carpetbagger. After all, she had grown up in Illinois and spent her professional life in Arkansas and Washington, D.C. The Clintons had only recently bought a house in Westchester's County's Chappaqua, north of New York City. Not too far from here, right? Westchester.
Closer to the west side.
Closer to the west side than to here. To try to counter this criticism, which could have been a political death sentence, she started what she called a listening tour across New York State. The tour brought her, among other places, to our editorial board meetings in Buffalo, a few months after I'd been named editor. When she entered the third floor conference room, where we held the daily meetings to plan the next day's front page, I cringed when Stan Lipsey, the publisher and my direct boss, greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. That was too cozy a relationship between newspaper publisher and politician for my taste. But Stan always did things his own way. He once passed around a photocopied list of dumb blonde jokes at the weekly lunch meeting where there were only 2 women, including me, at a table of a dozen newspaper executives. I complained afterward, and it didn't happen again. I hadn't met Hillary before, but I wondered with some trepidation if she was aware that only a few months earlier, I had made national news by asking then President Bill Clinton a most unwelcome question at the annual conference of the American Society of Newspaper Editors in Washington. President Clinton, who had been impeached in 1998 and acquitted the following year, had been trying to change the subject from impeachment as he spoke to hundreds of news editors. I conferred with our Washington bureau chief, Douglas Turner, and we came up with a provocative question for me to pose. If his vice president, Al Gore, was elected that year, would Clinton ask for a pardon for any possible crimes committed during his presidency? I raced up to one of the several standing microphones in a huge hotel ballroom so that I could ask one of the first questions. I identified myself as the editor of the Buffalo News and fired away. The president reacted angrily, smacking the lectern in apparent frustration. This was clearly something he did not want to address, since it put the attention of the nation's newspaper editors, and thus the nation, squarely back on his impeachment for perjury and obstruction of justice. That sordid saga had begun with his affair with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. But he had no choice under the circumstances, and he answered the question. No, he wouldn't ask for or accept a pardon. This was news. Not only did the story about his answer appear on the front pages of the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post the next day, but some of this national coverage identified me as the questioner, as if it were truly remarkable for a feisty woman editor from the provinces to challenge the President of the United States. My journal entry from April 14th, 2000, jotted down at Reagan National Airport as I left Washington, began, well, it looks as if I've used up a few of my 15 minutes of fame. I noted that I hadn't slept much. I kept seeing myself at the microphone, rehearsing after the fact. But if Hillary, now visiting our editorial board meeting, had any recollection of my encounter with her husband, I think she must have. She didn't give a hint in that Buffalo News editorial board meeting. She was cordial and businesslike. After it concluded, she asked me quietly if I could point her to the ladies' room. We were, after all, almost the only women in the room. Rather than just point, I accompanied her across the newsroom. We chatted as we went, a walk and talk scene out of the West Wing, and I could feel the newsroom staff's eyes on us. She would go on to win the Senate seat in 2000 and again in 2006, but wouldn't finish her second term because soon after the 2008 election, President Obama named her Secretary of State. But Hillary, back in Buffalo, always well-prepared and knowledgeable, made a point of observing to me that there weren't many top newspaper editors in the nation who were women. I appreciated that she knew such a thing, and her observation accomplished what perhaps it was intended to do, give me a sense that we had something in common as groundbreakers. Often portrayed as cold or unlikable, she came off to me as quite the opposite. She was personable and easy to identify with, as well as in complete command of Western New York minutia. She could talk in detail about the region's bridges and water treatment facilities and about its economic troubles stemming from the loss of manufacturing jobs, like the ones years before at Bethlehem Steel in Lackawanna. But she also was willing to speak personally, and even then, in that short chat, as we walked to the ladies' room, we mentioned our children. Mine were in grade school at the time, while her daughter Chelsea was at Stanford University. It went unexpressed, but seemed understood that we both had the experience of being the first woman to do a particular job or be the only woman in a room full of decision makers. So that's just a little glimpse into life at the Buffalo News. And later in my book, I have a chapter called "But Her Emails," which is about the New York Times's treatment of the email, scandal, if you want to call it that, the overplay of it, and I think the obsession with it. I feel as though I'm not a political person. As soon as I got to any position of power or influence at the Buffalo News, I made sure I was registered as a blank, not as a member of a particular party. And, I don't think, sometimes I hear people saying to me, we need to win the midterms, or and I'm like, I'm not part of the we, as a journalist, I don't see myself that way. So, my view of Hillary is not about, liking Democrats or something like that. It's just, I reacted to her as a woman. And then I think seeing the way she was covered during an era when Donald Trump was also covered, but not to nearly as great an extent. And I try to analyze in my chapter, "But Her Emails," why it happened that the Times in particular was so obsessed with Hillary. So there's a lot about Hillary in here, but it's not a Hillary book by any means. So I did this job. I stayed at the Buffalo News for 32 years, from the time I was a kid to becoming editor and being editor for a long time. And I could have stayed there and probably be retiring from the Buffalo News this year, but I didn't do that. While I was there, I started reading these columns being written by Dan Okrent at the New York Times. Now, he had been appointed the paper's first public editor, and the public editor, as some of you know, is a weird role. It's sort of an internal watchdog at the paper, a reader's representative, an internal watchdog. And it's a weird thing because you're kind of like internal affairs at the police, in the police department, or like an inspector general in a federal agency. You're both part of the organization and outside it. So what would happen is readers would make complaints to the public editor, and then you'd take the complaints to the decision makers and write a column in the New York Times about the whole thing. So I was watching Dan Okrent's columns. I got very interested in them, and I thought I would really like to do that job. And eventually there came a point where I was at a point in my life where I could move, and the job came open, and I tried very hard to get it, and did indeed get it, and pulled up my roots in Buffalo and moved to New York City in 2012. And so 10 years ago, spent 4 years at the New York Times as public editor, which was a wild time. And just a very difficult job with a lot of tension, a lot of inherent tension in it, because you're sitting in the newsroom and you're basically there to criticize your colleagues in public. So very, very tough job. And it's not a great way to get invited to a lot of newsroom parties. That's that much is certain. But I learned a lot. I felt confident doing it for whatever reason. You know, people would always say, oh, you know, Buffalo, you must have been so daunted when you came to the New York Times, but I didn't feel that way. I was very seasoned as a journalist, and I felt like, you know, for maybe I shouldn't have felt this way, but I did feel very confident. And you know, I tried to be very fair. I tried to make sure I listened to everyone, got their point of view, represented it fairly. But what I found out was that the readers did not just want to hear the complaint and hear the answer. They wanted some judgment. They wanted you to say, and here's what I think about it. And I learned that. And so I had a tagline at the end of the columns that, or the blog posts that I would write. So I would air the complaint, get the response, and then I would have this sort of lead in line that was, and here's my take. And I would render my judgment. Which didn't always make people happy. In fact, generally did not. But it was a great experience. And then Arthur Salzberger, who I reported to indirectly, you know, you don't report up through the editors because they want you separate from them. So I reported to the publisher, but he left me alone, which was a blessing. And, you know, he asked me to stay longer. It was now 2016. And he asked me if I'd like to stay another couple years. And I decided I should leave because I felt like I was losing my sense of being an outsider. I felt like I was becoming a part of the newsroom, and I didn't want to be a part of the newsroom because you have to have the sense of being able to have some critical distance. So I got a job at the Washington Post, which of course is a fabulous paper, and a place I had admired and read my entire life. I grew up in the, you know, as a kid, I was fascinated by Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein and all the President's Men. I went to Georgetown, so I had, you know, read it then, and, you know, it was a great place for me to be as media columnist. So I get there and I'm thinking like, well, this will be interesting. I'll probably write a lot about the digital transformation of media and, you know, stuff like that. And my first couple of assignments were to go to the 2 political conventions in 2016, one in Philadelphia and one in Cleveland. And of course, after that, it was all Trump all the time. And really, my 2 subjects that I wrote about in the next 6 years were either Trump related in some way or related to the decline of local journalism, which has been an obsession and a very deep concern of mine. And I think that those things are related when we think about the decline of trust in the news media, because it's actually local news that people trust more, but it's also paradoxically local news that is so threatened. So I'm going to read one other short thing, and then I'll love to hear your questions. Okay, so maybe this is a little bit more on the manifesto side of things. What I've found in every newsroom where I've ever worked is that reporters and editors are motivated by many things. There's competition, trying to get the scoop, to break the news first. This is a strong, impossible to extinguish drive that can't be separated from the kind of ambition that brings journalists to the highest levels of their business. And to some extent, it's a positive force. There also, as motivation, is also finding the biggest audience or the most clicks for some news organizations. That is less about clicks than about converting one-time readers to subscribers. But it often amounts to the same thing, getting the audience's eyeballs on your story and keeping them on your site. There's the desire to sound smart, savvy, and maybe a little jaded. There's the desire to win journalism prizes by writing stories, sometimes very long stories that have gravitas and impact. There's the desire to look balanced, and to avoid any accusations of bias, especially from often extremely aggressive right-wing critics. I wrote about this frequently in my Washington Post media column, calling for a new kind of framing. I identified what gets in the way. Mainstream journalists, I wrote, want their work to be perceived as fair-minded and nonpartisan. They want to defend themselves against charges of bias, I wrote in one column. So they equalize the unequal. This practice seems so ingrained as to be unresolvable. And there's sort of an inside journalism name for this practice, which is both sidesing. You're both sidesing that thing. And that sounds good, right? You do want to get both. You want to gear everybody up. But if you are giving equal weight to something that's false and something that's true, that's not a good way to do journalism. And, you know, kind of a cartoonish way to describe this is it is not the journalist's job to listen to people who say it's raining outside and to people who say, oh no, it's perfectly sunny. The journalist's job is to walk outside and see what the weather is and not just take things down the middle for the sake, you know, this kind of performative neutrality. So I have a few recommendations and I'll hit them just quickly here. Ways to do a little bit better. And I'm talking about political journalism right now, national politics. Toss out the insidious inside politics framework and replace it with a pro-democracy framework. One way to do this is to establish new beats and teams of journalists to cover attacks on voting rights and other basic elements of a working democracy, and to treat this coverage as of utmost importance. Stop calling reporters who cover what happens in Washington political reporters. Start calling them government reporters. It's changing the way we think about things. Stop asking who the winners and losers are in the latest political skirmish. Start asking who is serving the democracy and who is undermining it. Stop being savvy, filled with smug insider knowledge, and start being patriotic. Again, I'm not talking about wearing American flag lapel pins, but about giving proper attention to the role of the press in a democracy and letting the coverage reflect that. So that's me on my high horse, my hobby horse. And I really believe all of that. And I think we're at a very critical moment in American history. And I have been urging journalists and citizens, I prefer to think of people as citizens rather than news consumers. I've been urging everybody to be very intentional in the way we're living in America right now. As journalists, we need to be thinking about how well we serve the public, not about scoops and clicks. And as members of the public, I think we need to be politically aware, engaged, not tuned out to the news, but being proper members of our society and our culture and our democracy. So so that's where I'm coming from, and that's what this book is all about. And I would love to take any questions you might have. I tried to give you a sense of what. There's a lot in this book also about being a woman in what is basically a man's world, and so that's a theme that goes through the book, and sort of coming up in the 1970s. Having very mixed messages from mom about what to do with my life, very mixed messages. I mean, my mom, just quickly, I'll tell you that she was very talented retail buyer for a department store. And when she got married, she dropped her career entirely and had her children and never really went back to work. And I always felt like she certainly wasn't sorry she had children and was a stay-at-home mom, but that she felt like a little like there was something she could have done, and she certainly could have been hugely successful. So knowing that, I kind of grew up in that and grappled with it myself. I tried to do all of it. Guess we can get my children on the phone. They can tell you how well I did. Anyway, are there any questions?
I share your frustrations with the both sidesing and how we still cover politics like a horse race. I'm curious what kind of reaction, if any, you get like from top editors
Yeah,
Are you
top
going to
editors,
change
right.
that, or?
Well, I was at an event recently, and I recently left the Washington Post. I decided that, after 40 years in the business, I wanted to do something else. And I'm actually writing a detective novel. And I'm going to be doing some teaching at Duke. But I was at an event, and the the national editor, Stephen Ginsburg, at the Post was there. And I said something, I had to give some remarks, and I said something like, yeah, I don't think anyone ever paid any attention to my suggestions and my recommendations. And he caught up with me later and he said, I actually think that we did pay attention to you, and we did. And the Post now has a democracy team. I'm not saying they did that because of me, but maybe I raised awareness. But I think in general, top editors don't want outsiders, even other journalists, telling them what to do. And even if they maybe heard it, they are unlikely to say, yeah, I've been reading Jay Rosen at NYU, and I really think that we need to change the way we do things. I mean, I just don't think that happens. Anybody else? Okay.
When you write, do you please the editor, do you please yourself, do you please the public?
Great question. I mean, I have been very lucky in the past 10 years because as public editor, basically had no boss. And as a columnist, I was able to really, I mean, occasionally an editor would say, the first impeachment hearing is happening, we want you to write off that. But mostly I could pick my own subjects. And so that is great in some ways but it means it's almost daunting. You can write about almost anything within your subject area. So I always tried to think, well, what could I do that would actually sound so basic, but what could I do that actually would be useful? Because you can always write some clickbaity story about the latest stupid thing. But, I would try to think, what would actually possibly be of service to the public, and let that drive the choices somewhat. But at the same time, I didn't want to be writing boring stuff that no one would read.
Yeah.
So, what I found at the Washington Post was the best thing to do was to write what we call off the news. Something happens and you jump on it.
Like you react to it?
You react, you use it as a jumping off point for something that you want to say or some reporting that you want to do. And because it's hot, people are talking about it right now. It gives it some impetus, and it brings an audience, and then you can say what you want to say, which might be something a little bit more lectury, but you can trick them.
In all your work years, how did you handle the different personalities?
I was thinking today because I mentioned this in the book about when I first became an editor in Buffalo. And so I was just a little over 30, and I was assigned 6 reporters to manage. I was a reporter on the city desk, and I had the government and politics reporters, and they were all men, and they were all, I was like 31 or something, I think, and they were all older. And the politics reporter was, one of these guys who was famous in the area, George Borelli. He was a big name, and really did not want to be edited by me, and we had some words, but I found out something important, which is that losing your temper or being a hothead as a manager is absolutely, you cannot do it. You always have to be the grown up in the room. And I learned it early the hard way, but I mean, I think it's so, and I think that's true of managing in any place, in any business, that if you're going to manage people, you need to bring a lot of maturity to it, and don't be you cannot be a hothead, and you can't overreact.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know, empathy, reasonableness is nice. I mean, I did an event last night at Cooper Union, and we got to talking about some of the decisions that were made at the New York Times in the past couple years. I mean, I don't know if you guys are familiar with these things, but they had this podcast that went wrong called Caliphate that, was kind of wrong. And there was an editorial written by Tom Cotton they caused an editor to be fired. And there, there were things, one of their most revered health reporters, Don McNeil, was fired because of an event he had been at in another country where he said something very wrong to some high school students, and he was fired. And people, they asked me like, well, were those firings really right? And I said, I hope that I could have handled them appropriately, but in a less draconian way. I mean, do you have to take your revered, are we on the record here?
YouTube.
Yeah, right. I mean, fine. I think that there can be sometimes I think there can be a more moderate way of addressing, staff issues that are important, not to say, oh, well, we're not going to do anything about it, but not always to be so harsh. And I think sometimes editors and leaders and publishers get a little panicky. They're under a lot of pressure from the staff or from the public, and they feel like they have to do something right now. And, I understand that. I mean, I've made my share of mistakes. But, so maybe that answers your question. Yes.
First of all, I have to say, I read your columns so faithfully. I loved every one of them, and they are a great topic of discussion in our family.
Oh, great.
With our kids. So
Thank you.
thank you for all that
Oh,
wonderful work. We were very sad when you left.
You can read my detective novel.
We will. My question is, I was so interested by your statement that you don't register, you don't want to be registered in a party. And yet, I get most of my news either from the Hartford Courant, the New York Times, or Twitter. And actually it's Twitter, like 80% of my news comes from Twitter.
Yeah.
And if you were to go on Twitter, you would see journalists stating very directly and bluntly their political opinions.
Right.
What do you do? What do newspapers do with that? The existence of that,
Right.
when the job is to report the news.
Right. I mean, it's a huge problem actually, and controversy in newsrooms right now, because when journalists are on social media, they're kind of trying to express themselves, and in some cases they're trying to sort of build their own brands, right? And in some cases they might actually be columnists or opinion journalists. I mean, another place this plays out is when regular straight news reporters go on TV and are asked their views, and they end up being kind of more opinionated than they would ever be in a story. So, I mean, it's been a big challenge for newsroom leaders to come up with social media policies that, allow their staffs to express themselves. And I mean, one of the parts of this is there are staffers who may be, for example, let's just say women of color, who may feel like they bring something to the table that they want to express that maybe isn't the mainstream journalism, way of saying things that's completely acceptable. And they want to bring their lived experience to what they're saying. How do you balance that with the desire to seem and to be impartial, nonpartisan? And it's very hard to legislate it. It's kind of like, I think you could say, like Potter Stewart did about pornography. I know it when I see it, but you can't have an editor editing every tweet either. So there's not a great answer to it. I mean, I've seen it expressed at the New York Times. I don't know if they've changed this, but for a while it was like, remember that when you tweet, you are, whether you think you're representing Margaret Sullivan, you're actually also representing the place that you work. And keep that in mind. I have taught journalism a lot, and I would tell students, no one is waiting for you to tweet. No one is waiting with bated breath for your tweet. So feel free and actually walk away from your phone or your keyboard, especially when you get worked up. It's not worth it. You can get fired for things like that. So I think to do a little less is helpful. More questions? Yeah.
Just to bring up another famous Buffalo person, what do you think it was that connected both parties to Tim Ross's
Uh-huh.
reporting, and do you think we'd ever be able to get back to a respectful roundtable that we used to host?
Right. Well, I think that Tim Russert, whom I knew, one of the things that everybody respected about him was that he did a lot of reporting. And so when he challenged people and he challenged everybody, he had the goods, and so he could come back at you with, well, this is actually what happened and that's not what you said. And he could, bring the evidence to the fore. But I actually think we're in such a different era now. The country is so fraught and so divided. The Republican Party is so affected by Trump and the, so filled with election denialists at this point that we're in a different era. And I'm not sure that Walter Cronkite or Tim Russert or any of the people we thought were so great could actually function that much better today. So it's a very challenging time. Let's do one more question, right?
Yeah.
Anybody want the last one? Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, I'm so glad that someone asked a question about it, because that really does bother me, because I really loved it, and I'm older than you are a little bit. I loved it when I knew that a reporter's writing went through an editor.
Yeah.
And this whole Twitter stuff to me is like, man, come on, there's a whole organization that your writing should go through as a journalist.
And with Twitter, you're filing to
You
the
should
world,
maintain that integrity.
Right.
I'm speaking for this
this news
news
organization.
organization,
Right.
right, in a journalistic manner. And the other thing, I'm so glad that someone asked about Meet the Press, because I was thinking about even earlier versions of Meet the Press when the public figure was on and was meeting the press. And now these days, you turn on Meet the Press and, oh, I'm meeting the press. There's the press. They're going to talk about what they think.
Right.
Anyway, I'm so glad you asked that question. So I'll ask this question. But I also want to make one correction, because I also read your columns in the Post that were in DC previously where we arrived. My wife and I loved your stuff. You didn't just write about Trump or
Local
operation of local media,
Right.
which I totally believe in 3 years so important. You know, book was great. But you also wrote a great column on Joni Mitchell. So
Funny you say that about Joni Mitchell, and thank you for saying that, because the very, very last part of my very last chapter here
I'm ready.
is about that story. Because I was assigned, Joni Mitchell was getting the Kennedy Center Award. And what the Post does with the Kennedy Center Awards is it assigns a profile, a reported profile to different reporters. So I was assigned Joni Mitchell, go out to California or British Columbia or wherever she hangs out these days and do a big reported profile of her. Well, great. I was a big fan. There was only one problem. She had absolutely no desire to talk to me. And I tried every which way and she
Did you
would
tell
not.
you're
talk.
almost Canadian?
I tried everything. I think I tried that. Anyway, what I ended up doing, I had to write a Joni Mitchell piece, or I felt like I wanted to deliver them a Joni Mitchell piece, and this is very recently. So I ended up writing kind of a critical assessment of 2 albums of hers, Chord and Spark and Blue. And I said that Chord and Spark was her best album. And I made the case why, and I brought my own, sort of teenagehood into it and all of that. And the column or the piece did very well, which means it got a lot of readership and a lot of response. And I end up saying in the last chapter that it was very fulfilling for me to hear back from readers who connected with it, and that it reminded me of why I got into the business, which, some people get in it to change the world or, to reveal corruption. I always have felt like the connection with the reader was the most important thing. And that piece brought it home to
It was
me.
really well done.
So thank you. So anyway, you'll read more about that in the book if you
So
choose.
could I ask
Yeah.
one more question? That is, okay, so I'm retired, I'm not gonna be a journalist.
Right.
What can I do? What can we do to help journalism.
Yeah.
Right now, I subscribe to 2 Connecticut papers or Post and the Times.
Well, that's, okay,
I've done that.
you're good, actually. No, I, what you can do, and you're doing, you're already doing it, so you really, you're fine. Is to stay engaged. Don't tune out. I mean, so many people have said to me, I can't take it anymore. The news is so bad, I don't want to know, and I'm not gonna pay any attention to it. I think being an engaged citizen, not just about journalism, but being an engaged citizen, supporting and subscribing to local and national newspapers and talking about these issues and talking about journalism with other people. I mean, that's, if everyone did those things, our country would be completely different. So I give you complete absolution, you're fine. All right, so thanks so much for coming. I'm happy to.
Thank you,
You're
Margaret, for
very
coming, for sharing with us, and thanks for all of the questions. So
Yeah.
we'll, I'll lead Margaret into the other room, but you're all welcome to join us. We'll have a signing line.